He stared into the mirror and saw a man he didn't recognize. Same eyes, same face, but behind the reflection, he saw the life he could have lived. The man in the mirror looked sharp, confident, driven by purpose. The man standing there looked tired, comfortable, and lost. He had worked every day of his life, yet somehow built nothing real. That night, something broke inside him. He realized he wasn't lazy, just disciplined in all the wrong things. This is Napoleon Hill Stories. If stories like this make you think, subscribe to this channel and tell us, what habit keeps most people poor? Ethan worked hard. That's what he told himself every morning as he went through the quiet rituals of a life that seemed organized but felt hollow. He woke up at 7, always to the same alarm sound, the same smell of coffee drifting through his small apartment, the same fading poster on the wall that once inspired him. Outside, the city was already alive, people rushing, cars honking, morning news echoing from open windows. But inside, Ethan moved like a machine programmed for repetition. The coffee was always lukewarm by the time he finished it. The shirt always a little wrinkled. The bus always crowded. He knew every stop, every billboard, every face. It was a routine so familiar that it no longer required thought. At the office, he sat at his desk under pale fluorescent lights that made every day look identical to the last. His monitor glowed with endless emails, reports, and numbers that no one would remember tomorrow. The air smelled of tired ambition, the kind that worked hard enough to survive, but not enough to change. He liked to think of himself as responsible, steady, reliable. And maybe he was. But none of those words meant fulfilled. He wasn't chasing success anymore. He was maintaining exhaustion. His colleagues admired his discipline. "You're always the first one here," they said. He smiled, pretending to take pride in it. But deep down, he knew he stayed late not out of ambition, but out of fear. Fear of coming home to silence. Fear of facing himself. Fear of admitting that he had traded his purpose for predictability. When he was younger, Ethan used to laugh at people who took big risks. His friends, the dreamers, the ones who quit jobs, traveled, or started things that might fail, he saw them as reckless. "They'll learn," he used to say. "I'll take the smart route." But the years had passed, and now those same friends were the ones building companies, buying houses, writing books, and living on their own terms. Meanwhile, Ethan had become the man watching from the sidelines, clapping for everyone else's victories while drowning quietly in his own safety. He convinced himself that this was maturity, that stability was success, that patience was a virtue. But patience without progress is just a slow surrender. It doesn't move you forward, it just delays your regret. He remembered the first time he read Think and Grow Rich. It was supposed to be a turning point. He had underlined entire pages, highlighted powerful quotes, felt inspired for weeks. But inspiration without action fades like perfume, strong at first, then invisible. He knew the words. He just never lived them. Napoleon Hill wrote, "Desire becomes reality only when backed by definite action." And every time Ethan read that line, it felt like a whisper meant for him, a whisper he ignored. Every day he thought about doing something new, learning a skill, starting a side project, applying for something better, but by nightfall, those thoughts dissolved into exhaustion. His brain told him he deserved rest, but what he really wanted was relief from his own inaction. He filled his free hours with distractions, scrolling through feeds, watching strangers live lives he didn't have the courage to pursue, laughing at videos that made him forget how little joy he actually felt. Every Friday, he met his old friends. The meetings had started as traditions, little celebrations of connection, but lately, they had become reminders of everything he hadn't done. They talked about opportunities, ideas, risks, growth. Ethan smiled, lifted his glass, and told stories that made him sound fine. Inside, though, envy gnawed at him like a slow disease. It wasn't jealousy for their money or success, it was jealousy for their courage. When they asked him what he was working on, he always had the same answers. "I'm thinking of changing jobs," or "I'm saving up to start something," or "I just need a little more time." They nodded politely, but he could feel the distance growing between him and the people who refused to wait for permission to live. He told himself that they had luck, or connections, or better timing. It was easier than admitting that the only difference between them was belief. He began to notice how easily he lied to himself. Every excuse sounded noble. "It's not the right time," he'd say, as if time were the problem. I'll start when I have more money, as if money created discipline. I'm just being responsible, as if responsibility meant stagnation. They weren't plans. They were elegant prisons, perfectly designed to keep him comfortable and ordinary. At work, the weeks blended together. He watched people get promoted who didn't work as hard as he did. He watched ideas he once had appear in other people's presentations. Every time he felt resentment rise, he buried it under rationalization. They're lucky, he'd think. They know the right people. But a quiet voice inside him, the one he tried to silence with busyness, kept whispering, they're not lucky. They're bold. One afternoon, sitting at his desk, he looked around and realized that everything in that office was replaceable. The chairs, the files, the names on the doors, even him. If he quit tomorrow, the company would move on by Monday. That thought chilled him more than failure ever could, because it meant that all his hard work hadn't made him valuable. It had made him invisible. That evening, he rode the bus home and stared out the window as the city blurred by. Lights flickered across his reflection, the tired face of a man who had done everything right and gotten nowhere. He wondered if life was supposed to feel like this, endless waiting for a moment that never comes. He thought about how he used to dream. When he was younger, he believed in greatness. He wanted to build, to write, to inspire. Now, those dreams felt childish. Life had trained him to aim smaller, to stay safe. But the more he avoided risk, the more trapped he felt. His comfort had become a cage padded with excuses. And deep down, he knew it. Every time he scrolled past someone doing something bold, a small part of him whispered, that could have been you. But he pushed it away. He told himself it was too late, that he was too old, that his responsibilities were too heavy. It was easier to be busy than to be honest. That night, before bed, he picked up Think and Grow Rich Again. The pages were yellowed, the cover bent, but the words hadn't changed. He read slowly, and one line stopped him cold. The starting point of all achievement is desire. He realized he hadn't desired anything in years. Not truly. He had replaced desire with routine, purpose with productivity, ambition with comfort. He looked around his apartment, the neat shelves, the muted colors, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and felt something heavy settle in his chest. It wasn't failure. It was realization. He wasn't living. He was maintaining. That night, for the first time in a long time, he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't distract himself. He sat in the dark, listening to the silence. It felt unfamiliar. But somewhere in that silence, buried beneath the noise of all his excuses, a thought began to grow. Maybe it wasn't the world holding him back. Maybe it was him. He didn't yet know what to do with that thought. But it was the beginning, the faintest crack in the wall he had built around himself. And for the first time, he began to wonder what life might look like if he stopped repeating and started becoming. The breaking point came one night in the most ordinary way possible, a birthday dinner that looked like any other celebration. The restaurant was warm and filled with light chatter, polished glasses, and the smell of wine and grilled food. Ethan arrived early, as usual, dressed in the same old blazer he had worn to every formal event for the past 5 years. He told himself he didn't care about appearances, but somewhere inside, he knew he was just tired of trying to look like he belonged among people who had outgrown him. When Daniel walked in, the whole table turned toward him. He wasn't flashy or loud. Success had made him calm. There was something in his expression that couldn't be faked. Quiet certainty, the peace that comes from knowing you've done what you were meant to do. Everyone raised their glasses. Laughter filled the air. Ethan clapped, smiled, said all the right words, but inside he felt like a spectator at someone else's movie. At some point, the conversation shifted to work, to dreams, to risk. Daniel, always humble, said something that burned its way into Ethan's memory. It wasn't luck. It was just deciding to stop doing things that didn't matter. Simple, casual words, but they hit harder than the wine, harder than any failure Ethan had ever known. Stop doing things that don't matter. That night, lying in bed, he couldn't sleep. The city outside glowed faintly through his curtains, but his mind wouldn't rest. He thought of all the hours he had given to things that never brought him closer to meaning. Meetings, reports, conversations that went nowhere, habits that numbed rather than nourished. He thought of the time he wasted defending his stagnation, the arguments he had with himself to justify why it was fine to stay the same. He turned over and stared at the ceiling. What if Daniel was right? What if success wasn't about what you start doing, but what you stop doing? He began to see patterns. Every wasted night of scrolling, every unnecessary purchase to fill emotional gaps, every "I'll start tomorrow" that became next year. It wasn't that he lacked discipline. He had plenty of it. But his discipline was misplaced. He was disciplined at staying average. Over the next few weeks, everything felt heavier. Even the sunlight through his office window looked dull, filtered through invisible dust. The alarm clock no longer sounded like a call to action. It sounded like an accusation. He went through each day like a ghost haunting his own life, doing, moving, performing, but never progressing. He began noticing lies in his own language. He'd say, "I deserve a break," after another meaningless day. "I'm doing my best," when he knew deep down that he wasn't even trying. Each phrase was a gentle sedative, keeping him asleep inside a comfortable nightmare. One evening, after staying late at the office again, he caught his reflection in the dark window beside his desk. The glass was like a mirror, but instead of seeing himself, he saw the city, alive, electric, filled with people chasing their ambitions. Beyond the reflection were countless windows just like his, but inside them, people were moving, building, becoming. And there he stood, still. The realization hit with a physical weight. He wasn't outside the system. He was trapped inside it, willingly. He whispered into the empty office, "What if I'm the reason I'm still here?" The words echoed softly in the hum of computers and air vents. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the blurred skyline, letting the truth wash over him. It was the first honest moment he'd had in years. From that night on, nothing looked the same. The faces of his co-workers, once familiar, now seemed like reflections of his own fear. He began to see how everyone was performing the same dance, pretending they were building something meaningful, when in truth, they were only maintaining the illusion of purpose. He saw how easy it was to confuse activity with achievement. He had been doing it his whole life. Each morning he felt a dull ache, a quiet resistance that made even small tasks feel heavy. Coffee didn't wake him up anymore. Music didn't motivate him. The world seemed covered in a thin gray film, as if life itself had lost its brightness. He tried to escape the feeling by working harder, but that only deepened his fatigue. Productivity without passion is a slow form of decay. Then came the collapse, small at first, then complete. One afternoon, during a meeting, his manager gave him feedback that felt like déjà vu. "You're reliable, Ethan, but you need to take initiative." He smiled politely, but inside something snapped. Reliable. The word used to sound like praise. Now it sounded like a tombstone. He walked out of that office feeling hollow. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, and his steps echoed in the sterile air. He didn't feel angry, just done. When he reached the street, he stood still among the rush of people and felt invisible. He realized how many years he had given to being dependable but forgettable, a man the world could count on but never remember. That night, he came home and didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, staring at nothing, the hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. He felt the weight of every unmade choice pressing on his chest. Somewhere between self-pity and awakening, he began to cry, not from sadness, but from clarity. The tears weren't regret, they were truth. He finally saw that no one was coming to rescue him. No opportunity would fall from the sky, and no perfect time would arrive. The rescue was inside him, waiting for permission to begin. He stayed there for hours, breathing slowly, eyes burning, mind racing. He remembered moments when he had felt alive, the time he'd written poetry in college, the idea he once had for a business, the conversation with his father about living with purpose. He had buried all of that under years of rational fear. And now, sitting there in the dark, he could almost hear those forgotten parts of himself calling out, faint but insistent. "We're still here. Start again." When morning came, the light through the window looked different. It wasn't warm or bright, but it was real. He hadn't fixed anything yet. His job still waited. His doubts still existed. But something inside had shifted, a small defiance, a refusal to stay numb. He looked around his apartment and realized it wasn't failure that haunted him. It was potential, all the things he could have been, still waiting for a chance. The fear didn't leave him, but it changed shape. It no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like proof that something mattered. Fear meant he cared again. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't see fear as the enemy. He saw it as a compass. It pointed toward everything worth doing. That evening, he sat by the window, watching the city move. The same lights, the same sounds, but he saw meaning in them now. The noise of cars sounded like motion, like life. He realized he had spent so long observing that he forgot he could participate. The mirror in front of him no longer showed a stranger. It showed a man standing at the edge of change, exhausted, yes, but awake. He whispered again, but this time not as a question. What if I'm the reason I'm still here? And for the first time, it didn't sound like despair. It sounded like responsibility. It sounded like the beginning of something new. Change didn't come with motivation. It came with disgust. It wasn't a bright morning epiphany or a cinematic moment of inspiration. It was quiet and ugly, like looking in the mirror and realizing you've been lying to yourself for years. Ethan didn't wake up ready to conquer anything. He woke up tired of his own excuses. That kind of fatigue is different from exhaustion. It's the exhaustion of pretending. He began small. One rule. Simple enough to remember, hard enough to matter. If it doesn't move me forward, I stop doing it. He didn't announce it to anyone. He didn't post about it online. He just began. The first day, he canceled 3 meaningless subscriptions. The next, he deleted every app that stole his time and gave him nothing back. He started carrying a small notebook instead of his phone, forcing himself to write rather than scroll. He cut out gossip, small talk, anything that didn't nourish him. He realized how much noise he had been living in, how much energy was leaking through cracks he had never noticed. He wrote a goal on a sticky note and placed it on his mirror, direction over discipline. He didn't fully understand it yet, but it sounded like truth. Discipline, he realized, had never been his problem. He could follow rules, routines, schedules. What he lacked was purpose, direction that made discipline mean something. He started waking earlier, not to rush to work, but to sit in silence with himself. The first mornings were strange. His thoughts felt loud. The stillness felt heavy. But soon, that silence became sacred, a space where he could listen to his mind instead of escaping it. He wrote 3 questions each morning. Asterisk, what do I want? What do I fear? What can I do today to move 1 inch closer? Asterisk. At first, his answers were vague. Asterisk, freedom, confidence, purpose. Asterisk, but as days turned into weeks, the answers sharpened. Asterisk, start saving. Learn to speak with conviction. Finish 1 small thing each day. Asterisk, the fog began to clear. He reread Think and Grow Rich, slowly, this time. He didn't just highlight sentences. He acted on them. Definiteness of purpose is the starting point of all achievement. He wrote his purpose down, scratched it out, rewrote it, refined it. It wasn't perfect. It didn't have to be. But for the first time, it was real. He began tracking his days, not in hours, but in moments of truth, those small choices that either built his new self or betrayed it. He saved a little money, resisted impulsive spending, learned new skills online, reached out to people who inspired him. Every action was small, but together they began forming a pattern. He realized something profound. Change doesn't feel like change when it's working. It feels uncomfortable, awkward, quiet. The world doesn't clap for small improvements. But he wasn't doing it for applause anymore. He was doing it to earn back his self-respect. At work, people began to notice something different about him. He didn't complain anymore. He didn't join in the endless lunch hour conversations about frustration and blame. He moved quietly, deliberately. When asked what had changed, he simply smiled. How could he explain that he had stopped being loyal to his limits? He noticed how much time people spent defending their own mediocrity, how passionately they argued for their inability to change. He had done the same thing for years. Now he refused to join in. The moment he took full responsibility for his life, he no longer needed to explain himself to anyone. Each night, before bed, he wrote down 1 sentence. Did I move forward today? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes no. But even on the days he failed, he had stopped lying about why. He no longer said, I didn't have time. He said, I didn't make it a priority. That honesty, though painful, gave him power. Weeks turned into months. The outside world looked the same, but inside him, a new rhythm was forming. He no longer woke up with dread. He no longer fell asleep numb. There was a pulse again, faint, but steady. He started to see results, small at first, more focus, less anxiety, a quiet kind of pride. He found himself enjoying the silence that used to terrify him. Silence had once been the space where his fears lived. Now it was the space where his future was being built. The man who once filled every moment with noise had learned the art of listening to his mind, his instincts, his faith. On weekends, instead of wasting hours in distraction, he explored ideas, practiced skills, studied success stories. He noticed patterns in them, the same law Napoleon Hill had written decades ago. Success begins with thought. Every result starts in the mind. Every transformation begins with a decision. He stopped chasing motivation and began building systems. Motivation fades, but systems stay. He created routines that made growth automatic. Every day, 1 hour of study. Every week, one new habit. Every month, one measurable result. Progress, however small, became his new addiction. Slowly, something deeper awakened in him. He started to believe again, not in luck, not in circumstance, but in himself. Faith, Hill wrote, is a state of mind that can be conditioned by repetition of belief. Ethan understood now. The more he acted like the man he wanted to become, the more he became him. He looked in the mirror one morning and saw the difference. The reflection wasn't richer or younger, but it was alive. His eyes, once dull, now carried purpose. His posture had changed. His voice had weight. He smiled, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. The man staring back wasn't finished, but he was no longer lost. He wasn't rich yet, but he was no longer poor in spirit. He wasn't fearless, but he was faithful. He still failed, but failure didn't paralyze him anymore. It refined him. He had stopped seeking approval and started seeking alignment. The old Ethan had been motivated by fear. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of risk. The new Ethan was guided by curiosity. He didn't ask, "What if I fail?" anymore. He asked, "What will I learn?" And that one shift changed everything. The days grew lighter. His apartment felt larger, though nothing had changed except him. He no longer felt suffocated by time. Every hour felt usable, alive. He realized that wealth isn't measured by money or possessions. It's measured by control over your own attention. And now he finally owned his. He understood what Hill meant when he wrote, "When your desires are strong enough, you will appear to possess superhuman powers to achieve." Those powers weren't mystical. They were clarity, focus, and persistence. The moment you stop scattering your effort and start aiming it, you change the outcome. Ethan's transformation wasn't dramatic. There were no crowds, no applause, no revelation shouted from rooftops. It was subtle, internal, invisible to most. But it was real. He had finally learned that change doesn't begin with action, it begins with awareness. Once you see the truth about your habits, you can't unsee it. And once you take one honest step forward, you can't go back. When he looked in the mirror now, he saw not perfection, but direction. And that was enough. Years later, Ethan walked past the same diner where his friends once gathered to celebrate dreams that had come true. The rain had just stopped, and the street shimmered beneath the glow of soft amber lights. Through the window, he saw reflections of lives in motion, people laughing, talking, living, and it made him smile. Not because he had everything, but because he finally understood what it meant to have direction. He no longer envied anyone. Envy, he realized, was just admiration poisoned by insecurity. The moment he chose growth over comparison, he became free. He respected the price of progress now, and he paid it daily. There were still days of struggle, of doubt, of questioning. But the difference was that now, every difficulty had meaning. He had become the kind of man who could look back without bitterness and forward without fear. He had learned what most never do, that habits build identity, and identity builds destiny. The difference between the rich and the poor, between the fulfilled and the frustrated, isn't intelligence, it's intent. The successful wake up with a purpose, the others wake up with a routine. For years, he had lived as the latter. He knew the pattern well, waking up, showing up, doing enough to feel tired but not enough to feel alive. Now, each morning began with the quiet power of intent. Ethan understood that success had never been a finish line. It was a process of alignment between thought, desire, and action. He no longer sought to achieve, he sought to become. The man he was now wasn't chasing results. He was living principles. And in that, he had found peace. When people asked what had changed, he answered simply, "I stopped being loyal to the habits that kept me small." That sentence became his truth, his philosophy, his quiet revolution. He taught it to his younger cousins, his students, and anyone who would listen. Don't confuse activity with achievement. Don't let busyness masquerade as purpose. Don't wear exhaustion as a badge of honor. He had once been almost successful, the kind of man who could talk about potential endlessly but never live it. Potential is a dangerous thing when it's never used. It comforts you while quietly killing you. Ethan had carried that weight for years, the ache of knowing he could be more. And yet, that same potential became his salvation the moment he acted on it. He realized that everyone has two versions of themselves, the one they live as and the one they could become. The tragedy of life is that most people die as the first. The miracle of change is that at any moment, you can begin to move toward the second. All it takes is a decision and the courage to honor it daily. He no longer measured time by years or paychecks, but by moments of awareness. A decade of drifting had taught him that minutes of clarity are worth more than years of habit. Life had once felt like a blur of repeating days. Now, each day felt distinct, deliberate. He had replaced anxiety with responsibility and fear with faith. Ethan stood there, watching people through the diner window, and noticed a young man sitting alone at the counter, head down, stirring a cup of coffee long gone cold. The expression on his face was one Ethan recognized immediately, the quiet despair of someone doing everything right and still feeling lost. It was the same look Ethan once wore every night of his life. For a moment, Ethan wanted to go inside, sit across from him, and say, "You're closer than you think. You just have to stop being loyal to your limits." But he didn't. He simply smiled through the glass, because he knew words wouldn't be enough. Everyone has to meet their own mirror. Everyone has to face that quiet breaking point where honesty hurts more than fear. Only then can transformation begin. He walked away slowly, feeling the soft drizzle return against his face, and whispered to himself, "You don't attract success. You become it." The city hummed around him, buses, footsteps, the rhythm of ordinary life. But everything felt extraordinary now. Each sound was a reminder that he was alive, aware, and in motion. He thought of the years he had wasted waiting for the perfect time. There was no perfect time. There was only this moment, and what he chose to do with it. Success, he now understood, isn't something you earn once. It's something you renew every single day with every single choice. When he reached home, he stood before the same mirror that once reflected failure and fear. Now, the glass held peace. He wasn't looking for validation anymore. He didn't need to be seen. He had seen himself, and that was enough. He whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, not for what he had gained, but for what he had finally let go of. The need to prove, the fear to start, the addiction to almost. He wrote one last line in his journal that night. Asterisk, direction over discipline. Purpose over pride. Faith over fear. Asterisk, the ink sank deep into the page, a promise carved into the story of his new life. He closed the notebook and turned off the light, knowing he would rise again tomorrow, not for obligation, but for purpose. And if you've ever felt like him, trapped between what you are and what you could be, remember this. You don't need to change everything overnight. You just need to take one honest step forward. Break one habit that keeps you small. Choose one thought that lifts you higher. The journey isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming intentional. If this story touched you, share it with someone who's been almost successful for too long. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments what habit you'll break tonight. Because your future doesn't begin when you get lucky. It begins when you get clear. And clarity, once found, never lets you go.